Guy is correct. I didn't read the DaVinci Code and just feel like I needed to go jump over a cliff or get overly angry about it. What disturbs me, and if you've never heard me on the radio or if you've never seen a DVD like this, you'll pick up real quickly. What disturbs me the most is when people manipulate sources and when they only give you a partial picture of an ancient text, some issue in ancient history, to really drive a position that they have. And my goal over the course of the whole day, this is the first session of what's going to be the equivalent of 8 hours. My goal is to get you to look at the data, the primary material, and as Guy said, compare that with the claims of the book. Sometimes this isn't going to be terribly exciting because what I will do, and that's not, now's not the time to click off the DVD. I'm going to explain what I just said. What I tend to do is I tend to try to show you the source, and when I'm quoting from a secondary source like a dictionary or some accepted scholarly work that is just accepted and used and praised by everyone in a given field, I'll give you the page. I'll give you the page number. I'll show you the text. I want you to have the information so that you don't have to just assume that I'm quoting it right or I'm, just such an honest guy, you can just always trust me. I think I am an honest guy and you can trust me, but I still like to put it in front of your eyes so that you can see that I'm not making it up. The last thing I want to say by way of introduction is I'm not so worried about Dan Brown. Dan Brown is an author. He writes fiction. He probably has gone a little too far in sort of implying, and in some cases saying that he believes this or that about his sources. The people that if I'm going to target anybody today, it's going to be the people he uses as sources, because I do think that they're being dishonest and I do think they're being manipulative. And I will name them by name. They know where to find me if they don't like it. And they're free to prove otherwise, because I think it's going to be pretty hard, because it's going to be right in front of your face. The first session that I think we need to go through is introducing Gnosticism for you. This is a term that you often hear related to the DaVinci Code and its contents. It's one of those terms that people throw around and you may or may not know what it is. But if you know the basics of Gnosticism, the Gnostic worldview, it will help you frame certain positions that are put forth in the DaVinci Code. And so this is where we're going to start today. This is the worldview behind the DaVinci Code. Now, the basics are this. In Gnosticism, they'll use the term God, the true God. The true God, you need to know right away in Gnosticism, is not a personal being. When I don't know if any of us in here in the room are Gnostics, but chances are you're not. When you think of God, you think of a person. You think of an actual being, an entity that has personality, emotions, that kind of thing, because you're used to reading the Old or New Testament or some other book, Western religion, and this is how God is spoken of. In Gnosticism, though, you have this sort of force called the light, the pneuma, which is a Greek word which means spirit. This thing is pre-existent and uncaused, and so that would be kind of similar to what we're used to. But this force actually has parts, but it's not a person. It's just like a force. Think of Star Wars, I guess, for lack of a better illustration. Gnostics will refer to the true God in masculine terms, the Father or the Spirit or the pneuma. Gnostics will also refer to the true God, the ultimate God thing, in feminine terms, as mother, also the first thought. The Coptic word is enoia, the first thought of the Father. So they sort of begin with this Father-God concept, but he's not a person. And then as this thing sort of is able to think within itself or do something, this cosmic intelligence, maybe that would be a better way to describe it. The first thing the cosmic intelligence thinks of is called the enoia, the first thought, and that is viewed in terms of feminine terms. Now look at this. This is a circle. I picked a circle for a deliberate reason. In Gnosticism, the ultimate God force is whole. It is complete. It is self-contained. It is self-existent and pre-existent. It has balance, masculine, feminine. It is androgynous. It's not just one or the other. It's not just masculine or feminine. It's both. There's an emphasis in Gnosticism on something called androgyny, which is this union, this sexless sort of thing, or this union of genders. I know this is going to sound kind of weird, but as we go on, you'll start to see how this works itself out, not only in the system, but in Brown's novel. The first thought, according to Gnostics, was, and they'll use the word, impregnated. Now, we're not talking about anything physical here, but they're using procreative language to illustrate for you what they believe. The first thought, the female is impregnated by the father and brings forth other eons or aeons. These are gods. So right away we have, us as, from our background, Judeo-Christian background, this sounds like polytheism, and in some ways it is. But the point I want to stress now is not essentially the nature of the system, but you have the true God. The true God sort of creates other gods. Okay, so you have this thing up above. The thing up above sort of creates within itself lesser things, lesser eons, lesser gods. The circle is androgynous, but the things that it creates are not. They are spoken of in gender. In Gnosticism, the universe is three-tiered. The diagram here has at the top, this is the true God. The true God, where the true God lives, is one realm. The bottom realm is the created universe, the world you and I know. And then there's this middle existence. And that's where the other gods reside. So from the true God, the whole entity, there are other divine beings created called aeons. You'll notice by the features here, some are masculine, some are feminine. Now, we're not going to get too far into Gnosticism, but what happens is they pair up and they procreate. Again, I'm using sort of literal language, but they produce other aeons. And so you have a whole system of gods, plural, underneath this divine thing, this cosmic mind or cosmic force. The middle gods are sort of expressions of the greater whole. These are called aeons. The word next to it, pleroma, means fullness. When all the aeons are together and in harmony with the true light, that is called the fullness. It's the way things ought to be. The fullness. We'll come back to that term. They are the true God's essence, and together the parts equal the whole. Now, the true God, again, or the light, produces these aeons. One of them is the Logos. Now, for those of us who are Christians in the room, Logos is a word that gets applied to Jesus in John chapter 1. But now mentally stop yourself. The Logos in Gnosticism here is not Jesus. This is not a one-to-one equation. Jesus is something else to a Gnostic. Just so that you know that one of these gods is referred to as the Logos. And the Logos, if you look at the hierarchy, the row here, the way I have this arranged, the Logos is considered the very highest aeon. He is the highest thing that the light produced. Okay, he's the highest. A few notes there. You will read in Gnostic writings, if you go down to the third bullet, the Logos is called the form of the formless, the body of the bodiless, the face of the invisible, the word of the inutterable, the mind of the inconceivable. The Logos is the primary expression of the light, this cosmic spirit thing that Gnostics refer to as the true God, the ultimate God. The Logos possesses knowledge of all the other aeons. He is the entire image and likeness. Now, if you look here, we have a father language within the true God. We have mother language, so we have father, mother. We have the Logos. And that forms in Gnosticism, you notice the triangle, this is sort of their trinity. Now, that's an oversimplification, but they will use triune language. They call it the initial triad, the initial three, Father, Mother, and Son. And they'll actually call these bodiless beings the first man, the first woman, and the first son. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is when you read Gnostic literature, and for most of us, it's going to be in the newspapers. And the newspapers or the DaVinci Code or some other work is going to start saying things like, well, I mean, this is really kind of the same thing as Christianity. There's the Son, there's the Father, there's this thing, the divine feminine, whatever that is. And they're going to try to latch on to similar terminology to make you think that we're all really talking about the same thing. Well, we're really not. Okay? The lowest eon, you'll notice the chain here progresses from high to low. It's a progressive dissipation of the pneuma, the ultimate light, the ultimate spirit, from the primary aeon to the last one. There's a finite number here. The last one, right here, is feminine, and that is called Sophia in Gnosticism. Now, this is a term that comes up in the DaVinci Code all the time. The Sophia is an extraordinarily important figure, an extraordinarily important aeon to the Gnostic system, the way they understand reality. Sophia is the lowest aeon. You'll notice that I have her chin right on the red line. That is because Sophia was sufficiently far down the line enough that she was close to the material world, and she's going to have some kind of interaction with the material world. She will, in fact, transgress the boundary. She sins and rebels in Gnostic thinking. What she does, the Sophia, and this is a quotation from one of the Nag Hammadi texts, the Sophia wanted to bring forth a likeness out of herself without the consent of the spirit she wants to reproduce, like the ultimate God did. She doesn't want to involve her consort. Remember, I told you the aeons were paired, masculine, feminine, and then they produce other godlike beings in the Gnostic system. She doesn't want anything to do with her male counterpart. A thing came out of her which was imperfect and different from her appearance because she created it without her consort. So the Gnostic story, the Gnostic mythology is that Sophia says, you know what? I want to be like the ultimate light. I want to be like the Most High. Okay? And I'm going to create of myself something. I'm going to imitate his behavior. And Gnostics view that as sort of a good thing. But, she kind of preempted the way it's supposed to be done, but it's still somewhat okay. Why did she do it? Because she is, according to Gnostic text, unconquerably prunikos, which means lewd. I am the whore and the holy one. I am the wife and the virgin. Holy, whore, wife, virgin. Think DaVinci Code. This act of, there's this thread running through the novel about how this sexual act, this sexual ceremony somehow is an act of worship. What they're trying to do, what Brown is trying to describe, and not all Gnostics saw it this way, but many did, was that this ritual act of intercourse somehow commemorates not only Sophia's reunion. We're going to talk about when Sophia gets back to the Pleroma, when she repents, but also the initial androgynous male-female togetherness of the ultimate reality. That's why the act of intercourse has a sacramental value to some Gnostics. What does she make of herself? She makes a being called the demiurge, which just means the maker. The demiurge is also known as Yaldabaoth, child come forth or child of chaos. You will see both translations. He is also called Saklas, the fool. He is also called Samael, the blind one. This being is none other than Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, in Gnosticism. The God of the Old Testament to a Gnostic is a created being. He is called a fool. Why? Because he runs around saying, I'm the only God. There's none like me. Duh. Okay, Gnostics consider the God of the Old Testament a fool because he doesn't want people to know, and he's going to create humans. He doesn't want humans to know that actually there's a whole bunch of aeons that are bigger than he is, more powerful. And there's even further removed from him this ultimate God thing. The God of the Old Testament to a Gnostic is a fool, is blind, because he doesn't seem to realize that there are other gods. He goes around denying it. He's either blind or he's an idiot. And he's just bad because he doesn't want you, humanity, to know the truth. Now, here's our line separating the middle realm from the realm we know. The demiurge is going to create the world, just like, in the traditional Old Testament. The demiurge will also create archons, which is a word that means rulers. The archons are mentioned in the New Testament. These are the principalities and the powers of the air, the rulers of in high places who are wicked. But in Gnosticism, the archons Yes, they're bad because the demiurge made them. But they're not bad in the sense of they're opposing God. They're actually, in Gnosticism, the archons are God's henchmen. They do his bidding to suppress humanity, to keep humanity from learning something. And we'll talk about what that something is. So the demiurge makes helpers, what we would think of as fallen angels or watchers or fallen sons of God, archons. It's really the same old thing. Together, the archons, now look, the key there is together. The archons and the demiurge make Adam. Let us create humankind in our image. A Gnostic would say the plural there indicates that the demiurge and the archons get together and fashion the man. It is a co-creation. Those of you who are familiar with other stuff I do know that I don't buy that position because the grammar of Genesis 1:26 does not support it, but frankly, Gnostics don't care. So we'll skip that point. If you want to find more about that, you go up to my website. Sophia looks down at this. You see the yellow line there. Sophia looks down at what's happening and she goes, this was probably a mistake because this guy's kind of nasty. The demiurge's kind of nasty. And now the demiurge is just kind of doing what I did and he's starting to make all this stuff. And I guess it was okay when he made this world thing, like who cares? And the archons, well, you know, we're more powerful than they are anyway, so I'm not too concerned. But Sophia takes pity on Adam because Adam is created to be a slave of the demiurge and of the archons. And something clicks inside Sophia, according to the Gnostic myth, that says, you know, I need to do something. This is just a little too far. I can't abide this. And so the Sophia, Gnosticism disagrees here. There are two versions of this. One has the Sophia voluntarily putting some of her divine essence into Adam. The other version has Saklos, the demiurge, being tricked into doing it himself. But either way, a spark of the divine, you've all heard that phrase before, a spark of the divine gets deposited into Adam. So that now Adam is not just a worm-like, creature that just can't think or has no mind and no spirit, just to serve the demiurge. Now Adam is flesh and spirit. He is material and he is divine. Okay, he's a mix. Adam then is used to bring forth Eve. In a later session that's really devoted to this DaVinci Code myth about how the Gnostics just treated women so wonderfully and the Christians are just the misogynistic Neanderthals of the ancient world, we're going to see that is not the case. In Gnosticism, I'll just telegraph one point here. In Gnosticism, Adam has the divine spark. Eve doesn't. Eve is less than Adam. She is less than divine to a Gnostic. That's not a very positive, affirming thing, for women. But that's Gnosticism really, as you'll see it in Gnostic texts, not in Dan Brown's novel. Advanced concepts, I'm not going to part too much on this. Sophia is redeemed. She's the youngest and last eon. She was furthest from the light. She makes a mistake. She's again driven by this procreative urge. Her desire again was viewed positively in that she wanted to be like the Father. There are really two parts to her. She's conflicted in the Gnostic myth. She wants to be like the ultimate God, but yet she has this own self-willed rebellion thing going on. Eventually, the rest of the Pleroma says, we can't let this go. We need to get Sophia back here so that we are full, we're complete. So we have the old Pleroma back, the fullness. And so what they do is they decide to attract her. Several high aeons, the Holy Spirit, these are all separate beings in Gnosticism. The Holy Spirit, the Christos, and Jesus. But if that surprises you, if you're a DaVinci Code reader, good. Because the DaVinci Code has characters saying that in the true Gnostic scriptures, Jesus was just an ordinary man. If you read the Gnostic text, you will not get that message. Jesus is an aeon. He is a divine being in Gnosticism. He's not just an ordinary Joe. These three devise a plan to attract Sophia back to the true light. The Christos appears to Sophia in the shape of a transcosmic cross. And now she sees that out in the universe, and she knows that this is a sign from the Pleroma that you can come back. Just follow the light. Isn't that a nice phrase we've all heard in our culture? Follow the light. it's Gnostic. You look, you keep your eye on the cross, you follow the light, and you will make it back to the pleroma. Her celestial bridegroom, Jesus, awaits her. Again, think of the Dan Brown, Jesus, Mary Magdalene. They get together, they have, intercourse, either ritually or just, to enjoy it, probably just ritually if Dan Brown's going to be consistent with his Gnosticism, but he often isn't. This whole idea of Jesus needing a consort, Jesus needing a wife to further the faith is this idea. Jesus and Mary Magdalene are mimicking the journey of Sophia back to the cosmic Jesus so that they can be one. It's an expression of godliness. It's an expression of fullness in the Gnostic system. That is your introduction to Gnosticism. I don't know what the time is here. 32, we have time, 10, 15 minutes for questions, but let me just summarize real quickly. The whole point with this is when you read about sacred marriage in the DaVinci Code, the reason that that is an issue and the reason that Dan Brown and his sources want to convince you that this was part of Christianity, that Christianity has suppressed the female, that Christianity has suppressed the goddess, is not because this stuff is really taught in the Bible. Okay, some will try to force it into the New Testament in some odd passages, and we'll talk about those a little later. What they're really saying is, look, this is the way this particular sect of Christianity saw things. And this is the truth. This is the real Christianity. And it was suppressed because these nasty church fathers that you and I think of as the orthodox, of Christianity, they were just prudish. They didn't like to talk about women. They didn't like to talk about sexual things. They tried to do whatever they could to suppress women and their roles in the church and their leadership and their character and everything like this. The reason, so Dan Brown, tells the story, is that they were reacting to what was really the truth, Gnosticism over here. And if you're a discerning reader, Brown has tapped into a cultural sensitivity here in our time, how women are viewed and treated. And he's bringing you along on that thread into the Gnostic camp, but he's not telling you all this other stuff. He's not telling you about, again, sexual sacraments. He's not telling you that the God of your Old Testament is a liar and a fool and a blind person and frankly bad. He's not telling you all sorts of that stuff. Now, he may not know it. That's possible. But don't be duped into thinking that, two sides of the same coin. There are fundamental differences between the Gnostic sect and what historically was Orthodox Christianity. The primary one is, I'll give you the primary two and then I'll take questions. Orthodoxy has Jesus as an uncreated being, united in essence with God the Father, and they are both good. Gnosticism has Jesus as a created being who is above the God of the Old Testament, who is bad. Those are not two sides of the same coin. They are mutually exclusive. Okay? So don't be led astray into thinking that we're just talking about the same thing. We have any questions? If not, we can take a little break and we'll move to the next one. Go ahead.
In Gnostics consider Yahweh our first the other aeon.
Yahweh is under the aeons. He is lesser in power than the aeons. He straddles, and really when he starts to create material things like the world, he moves away from the middle realm down to the lower realm in the Gnostic universe. He is derivative from one of them, and even the lowest of them. So he is not on a par. Another question? In the back?
So there were Gnostics at the time of Jesus, right? And where did they come from? Where did the Gnostic thinking come from? And where did they fit into that time in history we as Christians view? Let's look at the view.
Right. The question is where, the Gnostics were around, they developed, where did they come from? Gnosticism as a full-blown system, you don't have what we call Gnosticism until the 2nd or 3rd century AD as a system. You have elements of its thought, of its worldview prior. And the strands come from different places. One of the more obvious is that it was a struggle, and frankly, if we're honest, it still is to some extent. It was a struggle to understand how you can have a God and 3 persons, but they're all the same, but yet they're not. And the Council of Nicaea was an attempt not to come up with a new position. The Council of Nicaea is arguing for an ancient way of understanding that. And in, I think, the third or fourth session here, we're going to talk about Jesus as God well before Nicaea. And frankly, the idea that there was a Godhead in Judaism. That idea is not a Christian invention. It's Jewish. But backtracking, it's hard to understand. I'll take you through some Old Testament passages today. And you'll look at them and you'll go, well, there's two there. How can that be? How can there be two gods? I thought Judaism was this monotheist, It is and it isn't. It depends how you define your terms, and it depends what the texts are saying. And they were struggling with this like some of you. When I show you some of these things, you're going to go, how did that work? Why didn't they get that? Or if they got it, why did they go over here with it? And that kind of thing. Gnostics are trying to just, they're struggling. And I feel somewhat sympathetic to Gnostics on that level, and to Arius, who was the focal point of the Council of Nicaea, his heresy, because he's just trying to figure this out. Another strand is Jewish mysticism. The idea of, well, what is it really like at home in the Godhead? I mean, what is it really like? Who lives there with God? And we ask these questions now. Well, before there was a creation, what was there? What was God doing? If there was no time, can God have thoughts that are in order? Can there be chronology before time? I mean, they're thinking these thoughts, and when the ancients are thinking these thoughts, they're essentially putting them down either in the heads or in writing. They're trying to systematize their thinking to understand what goes on with God and what's his relationship to these other beings that we see in the Scripture. We see plural Elohim in the Old Testament. We see the Word. We see the name. We see the angel of the Lord. We see the one who rides on the clouds, who isn't Yahweh in Daniel 7. They're reading their Bibles, and they're trying to grapple with how to correctly systematize this. Now, what happens is you take those questions, which are all legitimate, and Gnostics come from Egypt, and what they did was they started to try to merge what they're seeing in the Old Testament and in Jewish writings. This is all before the New Testament's written, and it carries on when the New Testament starts getting written. And they start looking for counterparts in the local religion of Egypt. And once that happens, you see this convergence of threads. And out of that comes Gnosticism. Another strand is, what about evil? Why is there evil? Orthodoxy has, I'm not going to say there's just one explanation for this, but Orthodoxy wants to see, and I agree, but I'm not going to go any further than that because there are ways to understand this, and there's difference of opinion. But the Orthodox position is that, look, if there's anybody in control of evil other than God, then we've got problems. Then we're dualists. Then there's a competitor to God out there who's just as powerful as he is, and that isn't reflected in the text of the Jewish Bible. The God of Israel, who is our God, the God of the New Testament, because the church derives from, Judaism in that sense. And so that just wasn't an option. But then that means that God is somehow in control, ultimately, of evil. Now, does God cause evil? Does he passively allow evil to happen? God is bigger than evil, so he can take evil and manipulate it and work it and predestine it to good. Okay, that is taught in the New Testament, these ideas. But to the Gnostic, here's the way the Gnostic answered the question. The reason that there's evil is because that's the way the world was created. There's no fall. It was just created evil. And if you have an earth that's created evil, somebody evil had to do it. And since that person in the Jewish Bible is Yahweh, Yahweh must be bad. That must be why there's evil. Because the fullness, the true God, the light, would never create anything evil. Therefore, there's a separation between the true God and this God over here who creates the world. Gnostics were troubled by the problem of evil. And that's an honest question. That's an honest issue. So I'm not going to portray Gnosticism as some sinister movement or force that, four guys got in a room one day because they didn't have anything better to do and say, hey, let's create a counter system to Christianity. We all just hate these Christians. Let's come up with something that mocks it and turns it on its head or whatever. No, they were asking the same questions that everybody else was asking. And they were doing some bad exegesis in the process, but the questions were good ones. And they were reacting not necessarily to, to the Orthodox point of view, but what Dan Brown tries to give you the impression of, and his sources especially, Brown's just a fiction writer. They want you to think that at one time, Gnosticism was the dominant view. And that was never true. There is not a scrap of evidence for that. Gnosticism was always a peripheral thing that was reacting against the majority opinion. And the majority opinion was not just based on, well, which way is the wind blowing? We have so much power here in the second century church. Forget the fact that the Romans are killing us off in droves. We have so much power here, we need to suppress these Gnostics. It's silly. But that's the view that Brown's sources want to convey you with. They want to give you this impression that, well, the reason Orthodoxy won was because Irenaeus and these other church fathers were so powerful, they just put the screws to everybody else. Hey, they're trying to survive like everybody else. Christianity is not legal. You can be killed if you have a copy of the New Testament. This is not a bunch of power-hungry slobs, dictating something to this little piddly group over in Egypt. It is just a mischaracterization of what the historical record is. But again, I want to leave you the impression, it's not that Gnostics were started out as this sinister group. They're asking good questions, but they're basically refusing the instruction, and they're not refuting the arguments of the majority. They're coming up with their own arguments, and that eventually leads to the Council of Nicaea, where they have their day in court, and they lose. Okay, because they cannot refute the arguments of the majority. It's not that they go there as the majority and then somebody gangs up on them and sticks them the theological knife in the back. That is not what happened. And we'll talk about that today later too. Another question?
So the Council of Nicaea pretty much put an end to Gnosticism?
No. The Council of Nicaea made a declaration. There were a lot of people there who did not buy what Arius was saying, but they didn't want him expelled because in their eyes he was still a Christian. He accepts that Christ is the way of salvation and so forth and so on. But the opinion came to be that, pragmatically speaking, we need to do something so that the rest of the ancient world knows that Arius's position is not, correct. So they did expel him, but even after he is expelled from his position, Arians are referred to as Christians in ancient writings. It's not that you're evil and you're going to hell now or anything like that. But the whole point was that we're going to declare that this position is incorrect. Arius is not able to articulate the position that reflects the ancient text. But we're just kind of hoping that, he comes back to the fold. Gnosticism and Arianism continued, along with their own followers. Eventually it sort of dies out because there aren't many of them, relatively speaking. But the ideas get picked up, in the Middle Ages by certain groups, early, late Middle Ages. It never completely goes away because some people like that position. They thought that was a good answer to these questions, but it was never, the majority, and they never produced anything that refuted the majority. They never did it, but they didn't really care because they just preferred the position.
Official start to the date of Gnosticism?
No, not as a movement. What happens is its threads go all the way back, into pre-Christian days, with your Jewish Bible in the first millennium BC. We'll say there are threads, there are ideas in Gnostic, what we call Gnostic ideas in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They didn't have Gnostics there, but Gnostics liked the way this guy over here wrote that. I like the way that scroll says that, so we're gonna use that to foster our idea over here. You have all these strands sort of converging in the second or third century when Gnosticism becomes known as a movement, and you have figures like Arius who become sort of, champions for this view. Anything else? Okay, let's take a couple minutes. Okay, the second session today is a comparison really of the Testament issue, the gospel issue. I'm going to make it a little bit broader than that. But the manuscripts of the New Testament, not just the Gospels, versus the Gnostic Gospels from Nag Hammadi. In the DaVinci Code, one of the characters, Lee Teabing, who is cast in the story as an expert on the Holy Grail, which we find out in the DaVinci Code, the Holy Grail is not a chalice or cup. It is a bloodline of Jesus. But one of the characters, Professor Teabing, says this: more than 80 Gospels were considered for the New Testament, and yet only a relative few were chosen for inclusion, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John among them. These texts, quote, are the earliest Christian records and the unaltered Gospels. Now, before I turn the slide here, there is a reason why, when the DaVinci Code came out, every scholar from any theological position, from the most rabid fundamentalist to the most rank atheistic liberal, said, this is bunk. And this is one of the biggest reasons why. These claims, as far as the nature of the Gospels, earliest and unaltered, are just frankly laughable to people who do this for a living. But again, it's like, well, it's just fiction. And everybody could have lived with that if it wasn't for the fact on the first page or the inside cover of the DaVinci Code, he talks about the meticulous research that went into this and how this is just going to change everything, and then successive interviews. That's what torqued people off, regardless of their theological position. Because frankly, scholars don't like when people invade their turf and say dumb things about it. Right? Now, what are the Nag Hammadi documents? You'll notice in red there on the map, the bottom third is Nag Hammadi, the place. The Nag Hammadi texts are a collection of 13 ancient codices, which is essentially what we'll call it a book, something bound on one side or folded, containing over 50 Gnostic texts. They were discovered by accident in Upper Egypt in 1945. The man at the center is the credited discoverer, Muhammad Ali Saman. Had gone off, kind of like the Dead Sea Scrolls story. He goes off and is looking for fertilizer in the mountains close to his village, and he unearths a jar, and the rest, they say, is history. The books that were found at this location were quickly sold into the black market. The Egyptian government eventually got them fairly quickly. This is what they look like. You'll notice that, as manuscripts go, this is pretty decent condition. You can get a whole lot worse than this. Despite the figure to the left there, you can see how tattered some sections are. They were taken to the Cairo Museum, and another few years went by before scientists knew about them. In 1966, at a conference in Italy devoted to Gnosticism and these new texts, James Robinson assembled a group of editors and translators to publish the codices in English. This is the cover of the book. I have it with me here if you want to look at it today. Robinson was chosen to oversee the project, and eventually a facsimile edition was published. Facsimile editions, they're just literally pictures of each leaf in book form. They're plates. If you've ever seen a book that has plates in it, that's what you get. It's only $750, so rush right out and get yours. It's an expensive set. Subsequently to that, though, there was a translation in English, and the introductory material prefacing the translation, this is taken from Robinson's book, says this: the library of 4th century papyrus manuscripts consists of 12 codices plus 8 leaves, so on and so forth. 4th century. These were Coptic manuscripts. Coptic is just the ancient Egyptian language put into a sort of Greek. A lot of the letters in Coptic and Greek match. There are a few different letters that were added because of the sounds in the Egyptian language that the Greeks didn't use. But there's a lot of overlap there in the language. But these were from the 4th century. Now, the 1st century, I should say this before we go much further, so you get this fixed in your mind. The 1st century is the year 0 to 99. 2nd century begins with the 1, as in 100 on. 3rd century begins with 2. You back it up a digit, okay? So 4th century, we're talking about written in the 300s sometime. This is Coptic, but everyone agrees, and rightly so, that the Coptic texts were actually themselves translations of older Greek material. One of the ways that's known is there are lots of Greek loanwords in the texts. There are other ways to tell that too, but we're not going to worry about that for today. These texts, according to the DaVinci Code, are the earliest Christian records. Okay. Boy, he didn't look very far for that. Here are some sources. And again, if you get the DVDs, you can look these books up if you're interested. And I recommend taking some interest in textual criticism. I know it sounds horrible, but it's actually really interesting. Text of the Greek New Testament. Textual Criticism by David Allen Black is a nice intro for the layperson. I recommend it. Dave's a nice guy too. He's a friend of mine. Canon of Scripture, F.F. Bruce, is a classic. And the latest work on the canon, The Formation of the Christian Biblical Canon by MacDonald, is really quite good. Again, these are well-recognized mainstream scholars with no particular axe to grind. Let's talk about the date, though. From those books were my sources, places you can go to check up on me as I go through this. If you look at the timeline here, you have the cross, 33 AD. We'll take that as a sort of a consensus date. New Testament Gospels and Acts, the book of Acts, which is the fifth book in the New Testament order, were written sometime between 50 and 80 AD. That is not a conservative fundamentalist number. That is a consensus view. There are very few people who would date them before. Some people would put Mark in the 40s. And there are very few people who would go beyond 80 for any gospel. 50 to 80. Now you have the presumed Greek originals of the Gnostic texts, and you can see with the blue there that we're talking at least 100 years after the New Testament books. And then, of course, the Coptic Gnostic copies. Now, why 50 to 80 AD for the New Testament? What's the evidence? In other words, are you going to come here and just have me tell you that and walk away thinking, oh, that's nice? Why do people say that? Well, there's actually evidence for that. 3 non-technical points for today are the Gospels, all of them, or at least Matthew, Mark, and Luke, prophesy the destruction of the temple. In other words, there's a prediction. Jesus makes predictions about the temple being destroyed. That happened in 70 AD. Everybody on the planet knows that. Okay? However, none of the Gospels mention its fulfillment. So the presumption is that they were written prior to the fulfillment of the prophecy, because nobody mentions it. And that was a big deal in Judaism, a huge deal. Luke never mentions the death of Paul and Peter in either his Gospel or its sequel, the book of Acts. We know from external sources that Paul died in the late 60s, 66, 67 AD. The book of Acts ends before his death, and Luke was written prior to Acts, so there you go. Do the math. Manuscript evidence. This is called the Rylands Papyrus. It is the oldest manuscript in any size of the New Testament, and it dates to roughly the 130s or the 140s, something like that. It is from John 18:31 to 33. This is when Jesus is in front of Pilate. I'm not going to translate the whole thing, but just so you know where it comes from. Therefore, Pilate said to them, "Take him, you all take him, and judge him according to your law." And the Jews said to him, "We are not authorized to put to death anyone." And they said that in order that the word of Jesus might be fulfilled, which spoke of the type of death that he would die, and so on and so forth. But the red are the letters that show up in this papyrus. And so this is what papyrologists and New Testament paleographical experts do. They'll take a scrap, and now, especially with the use of computers, you can find where the matches are in a document. Okay? This is the oldest one. Now, if this manuscript dates to the 130s, the original, logically, let's put our thinking caps on, logically would have been prior to the 130s. Okay? Again, why doesn't Brown or his sources go into this? They either don't know it, which isn't good if you're writing, especially if you're claiming to write nonfiction, or they don't want you to know, which is probably worse. Do we have any other hard evidence that the New Testament Gospels are older than the oldest Nag Hammadi material? What about the rest of the New Testament? Well, the answer is yeah, we do. Very simply, early church fathers, early church writers quote the New Testament. Like, what else would they quote? They're doing sermons, they're doing commentaries, they're writing theologies, they're quoting the New Testament. And we know when these guys lived because of Roman records. Okay, we know when they lived. We know when Barnabas, we know all these figures, their dates and everything else. So when they quote something, it fixes a date for that quotation. The thing they're quoting must have existed prior to the quotation. This is simple, coherent logic that apparently escapes Brown's sources, or again, they just don't want you to know. Epistle of Barnabas, there the date 70 to 79, quotes Matthew and Mark. The Didache quotes Matthew extensively, and that's between 70 and 130. Luke and John are both quoted in what's called the Muratorian fragment, again, 170 to 180. There are external methods of dating too, paleographical analysis, carbon-14, whatnot. Polycarp, these are his life dates, 69 to 155, lived a long life. He was a convert of the Apostle John, the John, quotes the book of Acts in his own epistle to the Philippians. The shepherd of Hermas quotes Acts several times. There you have the dates. The epistles of Paul. Romans is cited by Clement of Rome a lot. There are his dates. He's also cited, Romans is cited by Polycarp in the Didache. 1 Corinthians is cited in the Didache and the shepherd of Hermas. So is 2 Corinthians and also by Polycarp. Galatians is cited by Polycarp and Diognetus. Ephesians and Colossians by Polycarp, Clement, and Ignatius. There you have Ignatius's dates. Philippians is cited again by Polycarp. You see a pattern emerging? What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through every book of the New Testament. Every book of the New Testament is quoted in a source earlier than the oldest Gnostic material at all. Every one of them, without exception. Epistles of Paul, more of them, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1 Timothy and Titus, again cited by Clement, the Didache. Ignatius makes allusions to the personal letter of Philemon. There's a debate whether that's an actual quotation or an allusion, but an allusion, works for our purposes. The book of Hebrews is cited frequently by Clement. James also, 1st and 2nd Peter, cited by Clement. 1 John, the shepherd of Hermas. 2 John by Polycarp and other sources. And the book of Revelation, cited by Hermas and Justin Martyr, whose date is 160. Every book in the New Testament is quoted by somebody before any Gnostic gospel was written. I'm not talking the translation, was written. Now, the only possible exception among the Gnostic material is the Gospel of Thomas. Thomas might be roughly contemporary with some of the later Gospels, but that is the only one, and there's debate over that. But I'm telling you because there's debate on it. Okay? And by the way, the Gospel of Thomas, if you, again, a lot of this scholarly material is really expensive and you have to be near a library to get a hold of it. But there are, you know what a harmony of the Gospels is? When they'll take the Gospels, the four of them, or the three anyway, the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they will put them together into a flowing narrative. There are sources by scholars, one of whom I know, Craig Evans. If you listened to Coast a couple weeks ago, Craig was on the show talking about the Gospel of Judas. He has produced a harmony of the Gospels and Thomas so that you know where Thomas quotes from the Gospels. Okay? Now, let's put our thinking caps on again. Again, I'm really speaking, to people who are going to view the DVD who just are enamored with the DaVinci Code. If you're quoting from something, that something exists prior to your quote. Okay, it just makes sense. So even in the oldest case, again, it's debated, Thomas might be later, but just so that you know, we're not running from the Gospel of Thomas. The statement implies or assumes several things. Let me go back to the statement. You've seen it before, but repeating it, more than 80 Gospels are considered for the New Testament, yet only a few were chosen. When Teebing says that, you, the reader, are given certain suggestions. Certain things are implanted in your mind. Things like that all the Gospels written in the ancient world were being considered at relatively the same time. Over 80 Gospels considered, like they're having this big smackdown of Gospels, like we've got to choose which ones are in now. That isn't true. Again, in the DaVinci Code, Brown's academic characters make the assertion that the decision over what books to include was done at Nicaea. Nicaea did not meet to discuss anything about the canon. We'll get to that when we get to Nicaea, the session on that. But it's not true that all the Gospels were around and they being considered at the same time. He also sort of plants the thought in your head that there existed no early consensus. In other words, roughly around the decades that followed the writing of the New Testament Gospels, for which Gospels told the true story of Jesus, there was a consensus about which Gospels correctly preserve the story. The early church almost immediately recognized what we know as the four. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute or two. But there was an early consensus. What Brown wants you to think is that, it was just so up in the air. What do we do? We've got 80 Gospels. How do we know? There was a consensus long before most of the other ones were written. And in fact, Thomas might be the only exception. The four were in existence before any of the other ones were around. That sort of compels a consensus if there's only four to start with. Third thing is that he creates the impression that all the Gospels were worthy of equal weight or consideration. Nobody believed that in the ancient world. Some liked others. Oh, that one's kind of cool. I kind of like the way that guy says that. And some of them, this is just ridiculous. Why would anyone want to read this? Who's the idiot that wrote it? I mean, it was an uneven thing. It was an uneven thing as far as the other Gospels. The fact is that the followers of Christ had chosen the 4 canonical Gospels very early, again, with the possible exception of Thomas. Now, here's how we know that. Okay, don't just take my word for it. Here's how we know that. John dies roughly 96 AD. We know the Gospels are 50 to 80. John dies right around 100. In 144, this is 50 years, basically a generation afterward, we have a guy named Marcion come along. Marcion produced some writings in which he divided up the books he thought were inspired or were worthy of canonical status, and he grouped them into 2 headings, the Gospel and the Apostle. Basically, the Gospel he liked, and then certain writings of the Apostles. Marcion was kind of flaky. A lot of church fathers took off after him, but the important point is that he was thinking of which books were accepted. He did not include the Gospel of Thomas. He did not include any of the Nag Hammadi Gospels. Marcion, to call Marcion Orthodox is really iffy, so he could have felt very free to include one of the Gnostic Gospels in his, but he doesn't. Again, you can go look up Marcion and read about him if you want. Justin Martyr, in 160, produces a listing of what he calls the Memoirs of the Apostles. In 170, Tatian did something very important. He produced what's called the Diatessaron. It was a harmony of the 4. This is 170 AD. Again, this is before most of the Nag Hammadi Gospels are even written. They've never even seen the light of day. Tatian produces a harmony of the 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And it's still available in fragmentary form, mostly in Syriac. The Muratorian fragment, again listed various books as canonical. Again, the Gospels, 170, describes the 4 Gospels, 13 epistles of Paul, Jude, and 2 epistles of John, and attributes canonical status to them. Again, this is well before we have Nag Hammadi Gospels floating around. Now, I want to rabbit trail in Tatian's Diatessaron because there's another reason why it's important. 170 AD, he produces this 4-fold harmony. This edition proved very popular, especially in Tatian's native Assyria, where the Syriac-speaking church was unwilling to abandon it at the beginning of the 5th century in favor of a new Syriac version of the 4 separate Gospels. Very popular. Now, the Gospel of Thomas, again, some people want to date roughly contemporary with the canonical Gospels, but here's the important point. The Gospel of Thomas is called the Gospel to Didymus Judas Thomas. And it shows that title comes from the eastern part of the Roman Empire, the Syriac-speaking church. That's the only place that designation is found, in that part of the world. That tells us that the Gospel of Thomas, whenever it was produced, was around in the Syriac church. And guess what? They did not include it in the Diatessaron. Tatian did not accept it at the level of the 4 Gospels. If he had, we'd have, the Pentatession or something, whatever is. I'm being a little flippant here. It's not the proper terminology in Greek, but you get the idea. You'd have 5. You'd have a harmony of 5, or Thomas would replace one of the other ones. Tatian did not deem it canonical. Guess what else? Tatian does not come from the western part of the empire where the evil bishops, the evil Western church fathers could, twist his arm behind his back and say, you better not, you better say the right things about the Gospels. It's also 150 years prior to Nicaea. The 4 were accepted hundreds of years before we ever get to Nicaea. If you're going to look at the primary sources, that's the only conclusion you can draw, because that's what they say. At least what we have left. Now, the other claim in the DaVinci Code, the Gnostic Gospels are the unaltered Gospels. I really love this one. The statement implies or assumes some flawed ideas. 1, that the Gnostic Gospels all agree on the details of Jesus' life and his teachings. The Gnostic Gospels don't all agree about who Jesus was and what he said and where he went and what he did. There are disagreements. They do not match perfectly. Therefore, there could have been some changes, some alterations, whatever. They're not this unified monolithic thing that, perfect agreement. It's just not true. It also implies that disagreements between the canonical Gospels invalidate them as accurate sources for the life and teachings of Jesus. Let's examine the logic a little bit before we move on. If I were to, well, let's just take a look here. Let's go to this one. The Gnostic Gospels do frequently agree or disagree. This is a quote from Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. You will notice here the portion that is in yellow. There are significant differences between the Greek fragments of Thomas, and we must therefore have, it must have existed in two versions, two redactions. So on the one hand, the DaVinci Code wants you to think that the stuff in the New Testament just disagrees all the time about Jesus, and how can any of them be right? There must be errors in there. They don't give us a unified picture of Jesus. Something's wrong here. But over here, the Gnostic Gospels are unaltered. They just present this wonderful story about Jesus, and it's so coherent. And we don't have these problems over with the evil, nasty New Testament where the Gospels disagree with each other on points. It is just buffoonery, okay? On the one hand, the Gnostic Gospels disagree a lot. On the other hand, disagreement doesn't mean error. Illustration. Let's go back to 9/11. Maybe some of you did save the newspaper. If you went to New York the day after 9/11 and you bought 3 or 4 newspapers about what happened on that day, would the accounts all agree word for word? No. I mean, pick up a newspaper any day and look at a common story, sports page, lifestyle, whatever. You have different people writing. They use different words. They highlight different parts of an event. Does that mean that any of them are wrong? Does it of necessity mean that any version is wrong? No. They might be, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, because there's different people. They write from their own perspective. They have a pile of information in a limited amount of space. Same thing in the ancient world. You don't go down to your Rite Aid or to Office Max and get another ream of paper. You got what you got. And if you screw it up, God be with you to find another piece of paper to write on, because it's not like you can't buy it. You got to make it. And it takes a long time, where you got to go skin the goat that you're saving, for whatever meal. It's just a different world. On the other hand, let's put yourself in the classroom. Let's say you're a high school teacher, professor, whatever, and you've given an assignment to your class to write a paper. And you go into class the day the paper's due, and you collect the papers, and you're shuffling through them in your office, and lo and behold, there's 4 of them here that they agree word for word. What would you think? Somebody's copying. We have plagiarism here, or somebody's copying, there's collusion, and whatnot. Let's take this to the Gospels. Yeah, the Gospels disagree. Disagreement does not necessarily mean that any of them are wrong. This is why it's kind of neat when people come along and produce harmonies and synoptics. Exact agreement would suggest collusion, but that isn't what you find in the New Testament. I'm glad they disagree, because if they all agreed word for word, that would look like they all got together in a smoke-filled room and said, let's get the story right. That's not what you have. The Gospels disagree again because of difference in audience, difference in personality. There are similarities because these guys know each other. They probably pal around with each other periodically, but there's also independent work. It's just what you'd expect in the normal circumstance of, those days. Now, I'm going to recommend some books. Again, check up on me, buy them. They're not expensive, at least these aren't. And these are the best sources for historical reliability of the Gospels from people who are scholars who are aware of the disagreements between the Gospels. Craig Blomberg has produced one on the historical reliability of the Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He has a companion volume on John's Gospel, same focus. This is not light reading, I will warn you, but it's the best thing in print, just bar none. Why 4 Gospels? Again, from my friend David Allen Black. Black tries to write for the lay audience, so if you're going to start somewhere, I'd start with Black, but the mother lode, the trench work is Blomberg, and Rethinking the Synoptic Problem, again by Black. Okay, that is the end of the session for the New Testament. We have, can't remember when we started, but we can take some questions again. Summary. I'll try to do this each time. The summary is you need to match the claims of the book and the sources Brown is using, that the Gnostic Gospels are older, that they're more consistent, that they're more reliable, that they're unaltered. None of those points can stand up with actual historical evidence. Guys who were alive, who were quoting the New Testament, we know their dates are fixed absolutely. They're quoting the material before any of the Gnostic Gospels even existed. Now, I don't know why Brown doesn't put this in his book. Or maybe I do. It wouldn't sell as well, I guess. But again, he's just a fiction writer. He's Dan Brown, cool idea for a story. Let's write one. This is how I make my living. I write neat stories. The people that I think are more worthy of blame, that are really guilty of, frankly, pseudo-scholarship, are his sources. People like Michael Bagent, Lincoln, Richard Lay, Henry Lincoln, Picknett and Prince. These people who are writing, quote, nonfiction, and they're telling you stuff, and they're not giving you the information. They either don't know it, which doesn't speak well of their ability and their credentials for writing this, whatever book they're writing, or they don't want you to know. They have an agenda to push. And either one is bad. I'm going to let them take the pick and explain to me why this stuff isn't in their works. Okay. Any questions? Yes, sir.
You went into a long parenthesis on the Gospel of Thomas as the only exception. And I heard the arguments, but I'm not sure exactly it's the exception is what it says.
Chronologically, yeah.
One that is as bold as the New Testament originals.
Yeah, the reason that is supposed is Thomas is the only Gnostic gospel for which there is Greek material. Remember, the supposition is that you have the Gnostic Gospels, they're all written in Coptic, they are translations of older Greek originals. There isn't one shred of Greek material for any of the Gnostic material except for Thomas. And since we have that from Thomas, and I mean, they're little pieces. It's not like you don't even have pages, in Thomas's case, but the Greek original is known because of the scraps that are there. And so the difficulty is, well, can we get a reliable date, from the scraps? It's kind of a carbon-14 problem, because to date it, you'd have to destroy it, and there's that little of it left. So the guess is somewhere, it might be as early as 50, which would put it contemporary with the canonical Gospels. But that's the only one, just because there just isn't material, for it. Another question.
This isn't redundant, but Thomas preceding made associated what cost was it usually it's considered your purpose as a Gnostic text. And how was it before and other epistles?
Well, have any of you ever read Thomas? Thomas is not actually, you've read it? Okay. Thomas is not actually a gospel like you and I think of a gospel. When we think of a gospel, we think of a narrative history of the life of Jesus. That isn't actually what Thomas is. Thomas is a list of sayings. Think of the book of Proverbs, and you have sort of an analogy. They're called logions, or logia would be the correct plural. They're just sayings, things that supposedly Jesus said. So the reason that this collection of sayings is viewed as Gnostic is because some of the content of the sayings, thematically and conceptually, will match Gnostic material that is much longer and more theological treatises. So that's where the association comes in. And even if Thomas is as early as the 50s or the 60s or whatever, what you have pieces, you have threads of the fuller Gnostic thinking that comes later. You have threads of that, little pieces of it resident in Thomas, which comes again as we mentioned last time. Gnosticism as a movement is the result of a convergence of threads of ideas. So you have Thomas reflecting some of those. If all we had, you could go to some Dead Sea Scrolls, and if you just selectively quoted certain lines, and let's say nobody knew where this was from, and you just put it in front of a Gnostic scholar, and he read this line, he'd say, "Oh, that's Gnostic." because it sounds like something that's going to be expounded in Gnosticism later. But so you have these threads out there, these ideas, and that's where Thomas would get the association. Another question?
So now, how did the Essenes fit into this? Like the Cathar Essenes? What period of time were they?
The Cathars are, of course, in the Middle Ages, and they're going to, just a quick comment on them, the Cathars are going to pick up on certain ideas that are associated with Gnosticism, and so they get linked to Gnosticism. I think somewhat fairly. It's not that you could label them Gnostics totally, but some of the ideas are there. The Cathars, of course, are centuries, frankly, millennia later than the Essenes. The Essenes, of course, are living before the New Testament era. The Dead Sea Scrolls will date on the spectrum. Some of the older Dead Sea Scrolls will go back as far as 300 BC. You have some that go into the 1st century AD, as far as paleography and carbon-14 dating. The Essenes are going to be residents at the place Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered. It's still probably the majority view that the Essenes produced what are called the sectarian manuscripts at Qumran, the ones that the community actually produced, as opposed to others they were collecting, like the Book of Enoch. The Essenes didn't write the Book of Enoch, but they had a library there and it was in there. But some of the Dead Sea Scrolls they produced and wrote about themselves and their own ideas, those are called the sectarian manuscripts. You will have certain ideas within the sectarian manuscripts, again, little threads that will show up later in Gnosticism. But it would not be accurate to call the Essenes Gnostics, because we don't have Gnosticism as a movement when I say movement, I'm talking about a religious system that has its own books and its own fully developed theology. You don't have that until 2nd or 3rd century, and we know that because of the Gnostic Gospels. That's the evidence for that. But you'll have certain ideas that are present at Qumran. A lot of the popular writers like Bagent and Lee and Lincoln and Picknett and Prince want to create some sort of association between the Essenes and the Gnostics and the Masons and all these other groups. The only way you can do that is to ignore the date of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I think there's one person, maybe two that I'm thinking of here. One for sure, there's one scholar who doesn't like the dating, Barbara Tearing, whose writings show up a lot in these other sources. So basically they're quoting Tearing against literally the thousands of other scholars who agree with the work of the team that produced the dating on the scrolls. And Tearing does not base her date on carbon-14 or paleography. She thinks that she's unlocked a coded language in the scrolls that convinces her that there's overlap with the New Testament, and that even though no New Testament characters are mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they aren't, go read them. I'm not keeping you from them. Go read the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're in English. You will not find any New Testament character in any Dead Sea Scroll. Zero. Nada. I don't know any other way to say it. You just won't find them. But that doesn't deter Tearing. She says, well, the New Testament characters are encrypted, and they're coded in there. And I'm glad you brought that up, Ted. The best book written on this subject is right here. Written by two liberals. They're not fundamentalists. They're not evangelicals. They're not Bible bangers. Okay, they're two liberal scholars, Jesus, Qumran, and the Vatican. Frankly, they got ticked. They got upset. And, I have often made the comment on radio and in venues like this that it is such a crying shame that scholars think themselves too far above the interested general readership to fool around with this nonsense that people like Bagent, Lee, and Lincoln and these other guys are writing. They honestly, I travel in these circles. Scholars generally are elitists. That shouldn't surprise you, okay? They honestly think that writing against these guys is just frankly beneath them and is a waste of their time. Here's an exception. These two guys finally got irritated enough with this twaddle that they wrote this book. It's probably about 15 years old now. Let me take a quick look. 1994, 12 years. And this is a thorough dismantling of Tearing and all these popular writings. You finally had two guys They weren't on the Scrolls team, so they're not part of the conspiracy, okay? They're just two New Testament scholars, early Judaism scholars that just said, enough, enough. This is nuts, and we're going to address it. So they did that. I highly recommend the book. It's out of print. You'd have to get it used, but I found a cheap copy, so you can too. Another question. Okay, let's quit then for a few minutes.